Hey you witches, how you doing today? I've got some more hot takes for you. Today we're going to talk about witch as a self-claimed title, as in we cannot assign it to someone without their first having claimed it for themselves, either historically or in modern times. So we'll get into it, but first, for those of you who are new around here, my name is Taya. Welcome to the channel. We talk about all things witchcraft. And for those of you who are returning viewers, maybe coming in from another video, welcome back. Thank you so much for the support. All of you, please consider subscribing. It's a really great way to help us build the channel. So, witchcraft is a self-claimed title. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is something you see a lot on the social medias. Sometimes in reference to the burning time and when the witches were burnt at the stake for, you know, we'll get to that one. Or even in modern times, right? With people referring to other practices as being like, obviously witchcraft. But here's the thing. It's only witchcraft if the practitioner of those actions calls it witchcraft themselves. So there's a lot of nuance here. But basically, I might do something as part of my witchcraft practice that is the same as what someone else does, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing witchcraft. So, like energy work, maybe Reiki, right? Reiki can be a part of my witchcraft practice, but everybody who practices Reiki is not a witch. Or tarot, right? I read tarot. That's part of my witchcraft practice. But there's a lot of people out there that read tarot that don't consider themselves witches. They might be a medium or like a psychic of some sort. They might be Roma, right? Lots of people practice, like, read tarot cards who aren't witches. And us turning around and saying, you're totally a witch, it's not exactly appropriate. Another really common one you see is suggesting that other religious systems are actually witchcraft. In disguise, so to speak. Often you'll see people comparing Christians and their rituals and rites and devotions as, like, obviously that's witchcraft. Like, they're doing spells. What are they talking about? But here's the thing. Those Christians, those tarot readers, those Reiki practitioners don't identify as witches, and therefore they are not witches, and we shouldn't be saying that they are. Even in occult spaces, there's a lot of folk magic practitioners that don't necessarily identify as witches. And they might do exactly the same things that I do as a witch. But they might call themselves a cunning folk or a sorcerer or a folk magic practitioner or a shaman. And it's not my place to say, no, that's witchcraft. Now, a more common place where you see this crop up is in a historical context. Peeps like to get all sort of riled up and talk about the burning times and all of our witch ancestors who were burned at the stake. You know, we're the daughters of the witches you couldn't burn. But here's the thing. The people prosecuted in the early modern era were not witches. They never claimed that title freely. And in fact, majority of them initially protested vehemently that they were not witches. They were cunning folk, they were midwives, they were outcasts, and they were mostly just people in the wrong place at the wrong time. So for us to sit here now and say that, yeah, they were witches, is supremely disrespectful. They never claimed those titles for themselves until they were under torture. Which, in that case, anybody would say anything if they're under torture. And yes, there were a small few who confessed to torture without torture, who were possibly actually witches. I'm thinking of like Isabel Gowdy. But keep in mind that torture then and torture now are defined differently. So saying they weren't tortured is kind of an understatement. Then it wasn't considered torture to deprive the accused of food, of sleep, of contact with the outside world. General beatings weren't considered torture per se, right? They were talking about thumb screws and pressing with boards and, you know, putting people in water to see if they sink and drown them. And, you know, they were talking about like overt torture, but there are other torturous practices that were very common at the time and were not outlawed. Just the general maltreatment of humans in custody. So stuff that today would be considered torture, back then was not. So saying they weren't tortured is not exactly right. So to say then by today's standards that all accused were actually tortured, it was just to different extremes. So for all intents and purposes, those accused in the early modern era did not freely claim the title of witch. Ergo, they were not witches. But, I can hear you guys already, right? But they gave detailed confessions of what they were doing as witches. They told about pacting with the devil and attending the witches' Sabbath and convening with covens and working dire magic. I mean, they knew what they were doing. They had to have been witches. And I counter that with no. They were sharing the popular folklore at the time about what witches do. The best way I can ever explain this is to liken it to Santa Claus today. If you put me under thumb screws and said, I know that you've met Santa Claus, and I want to make that torture stop, I'm going to say, absolutely. I can tell you where he lives. I can tell you about his wife. I can tell you about how he's dressed. I can even tell you that he smells like peppermint and gingerbread. I can tell you about his magical reindeer. I can tell you how they can fly. I can tell you about his sleigh. I can tell you about his special day of the year. I can tell you about how he delivers presents. I can tell you anything you want to know about Santa Claus. Just make the torture stop. Have I actually met Santa Claus in real life? No, he's a fictional character. Same thing with witches back then. There was all kinds of gossip and basically what we would now consider folklore about what witches did, right? Oh my gosh, did you hear? I heard that witches eat babies. That's what went around back then. So when people were put under torture, they're like, okay, I will confess to all of these things that I have heard that witches do. It doesn't mean that they did it themselves. So why is this so important that we, maintain witch as a self-claimed title? I've got 3 reasons. The first one is there are places and there are other practices within this world where it's highly offensive. To call a Christian a witch is offensive to a Christian, right? And I'd like to think that we're not out there trying to purposely offend people. If that's your game, you're not making us witches look good, right? It's just not cool. Don't do that. Number 2, there are places in the world where it is literally life-threateningly dangerous to be considered a witch. I'm thinking of like the African diasporic countries, right? It is, in some of those areas, punishable by death to practice witchcraft. So just willy-nilly throwing that around at people, you don't know somebody's background, what culture they come from, who's going to overhear that? Like, it's just not cool to call other people witches. And thirdly, is it's a very colonizer mindset. I see it, therefore that's what it is. It discounts all of the beautiful nuance of the various religions and occult systems that are out there. Right? Trying to lump everything in under one, trying to like make everybody be witches. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? If somebody isn't identified as a witch, don't call them a witch. Like, they're just not. So yeah, that's kind of my take for the day. Stop acting like an offensive, dangerous colonizer. Witch is a self-claimed title. And I'm sure you've all got thoughts and opinions on this now. So go ahead, leave us a comment below. Just remember to be respectful and let's have a discussion. Thanks so much, you guys. That's our video for today. We'll catch you in the next one. Mwah.